Looking at Africa today, what do you see? You see rebellion. You see something close to revolution in South Africa. You see in poor Somalia starvation, gang wars, warlords roving back and forth, and nobody can do much about it. Certainly not the people who have dominated Africa for the last century and a half. Not the British, not the French, not the Germans, not the Spanish, not the Portuguese, not the Belgians. Nobody. I'm wondering whether these African Americans that we saw, some of us saw in Malcolm X, don't have a little extra edge. They have this pride, they have this ability to organize, and they have forward momentum in a way that nobody in Europe has. They also have a common ancestry. I suspect that there may be a secret relationship here in the future between black America and black Africa, which could be very constructive indeed. Or it may not be. I've been told that native Africans don't trust Afro-Americans any more than they trust the average white American or white Frenchman or white Englishman. But our speaker knows more about all that than I do, and so I'll stop talking and let him talk to you. Our speaker is now Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. His policy portfolio includes West and Central Africa, terrorism, narcotics, and the Peace Corps. There's a plateful for you. Before that, he was president of the African Development Foundation, which is a public corporation established by the United States Congress. He grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, went to Ohio State. He went to the State University of New York. He went to Harvard, and he went to American University and amassed a master's and a doctorate along the way. His field is at least partly anthropology. He was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in 1983. He's going to speak to us tonight on the promise and challenges of democracy towards Africa. So with great pleasure, I give you Leonard H. Robinson, Jr. Welcome to Baltimore.
Thank you. I had a grandmother who used to live on Druid Hill Avenue. She's dead now, but I feel like I'm at home. I want to thank Mr. Byrd and Mr. Jacobs for this warm welcome and the opportunity to speak to you tonight and to share some of my insights and knowledge about the vast and diverse and to some extent complicated continent of Africa. Now, I want to give you a warning, first of all, that all of you are in trouble tonight because I was offered a drink when I first came in. And as we all know, if you're going to do some public speaking, you shouldn't drink before you do so. So I'm not responsible for anything that I say. Mr. Jacobs, in his remarks before he formally introduced me, raised some very interesting questions and perspectives about what's happening in Africa today and about perhaps the unique role that African Americans might be able to play in resolving some of the conflicts of Africa. I don't know if African Americans have a special edge. We have a special entree. It's what I call the 5-second recognition factor. We are both people of color. I think that Africans are probably the least prejudicial people in the world. They have an extraordinary capacity for hospitality. And it's not so much who you are, but what's inside your heart and your head that counts with Africans. They can tell within minutes. It's a certain sixth sense, if you will, They can tell within minutes whether or not you are friend or foe. And after that, after they've made up their minds about where you're coming from, they move on. I have been involved as the Department of State's point person on conflict resolution with respect to the tragic civil war in Liberia for the past 2 years. Mr. Byrd asked me if I travel a lot, and I said yes. In fact, Mr. Jacobs acknowledged the fact that I probably don't know that I'm in Baltimore tonight. Since March of last year, I have made 19 trips to Europe and West Africa in the quest of peace, an end to the civil war in Liberia. I don't think the fact that I am African American has made that much difference in terms of the pace at which we are moving to bring this tragic war to a close. However, I think that being an African American with the background that I have has given me perhaps an advantage, and Africans do trust African Americans. They trust anybody that they feel can be trusted. Perhaps some of these issues will surface in the Q&A section after my prepared remarks. The promises and challenges of democracy in Africa today. For the past 3 decades, in other words, during the period which saw African countries gain independence, U.S. policy toward Africa has essentially been driven by 3 overriding concerns for the continent. 1, economic development, 2, democratization, and 3, conflict resolution. Economic development subsumes humanitarian assistance. Individual administrations may, of course, have chosen to focus attention differently on one aspect or another, to have emphasized one particular concern or another. But the overall interest of our policy have been generally consistent. For the last 3 years, Africa has been undergoing a series of changes almost as sweeping as those which brought the wave of independence in the late 1950s and 1960s. These changes are occurring in precisely those areas I just mentioned as the long-term focus of U.S. policy in Africa. There have been dramatic changes in economic philosophy. There has been a continent-wide interest in democratization. In fact, I would classify it as a revolution, a second revolution. And there has been movement toward the resolution of some of Africa's long-standing internal conflicts. These 3 areas represent both the promises of and challenges to democracy in Africa, although the impetus for these changes has been autochthonous, has come from the sand and the soil of Africa itself. It has obviously been accompanied by a fortuitous set of major international developments which have affected the ability of authoritarian African governments to sustain themselves. The collapse, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the end of Cold War tensions removed the prime justification for outside support of old-line authoritarian regimes, such as that of Siad Barre in Somalia, for example. At the same time, the donor community and international financial institutions have adopted an increasingly hard line regarding chronic human rights violations in Africa and put these people on notice that fundamental changes are expected in the way these countries treat their citizens. Also significant have been changes in communications over the last several years which have made it almost impossible for one-party regimes to isolate themselves and their citizens from exposure to Western ideals and international criticism. Satellite television, with its worldwide news programs, can be picked up virtually everywhere in Africa. Fax machines have revolutionized the way information can be quickly circulated. Personal computers and desktop publishing technology make it possible for almost anyone to put together a newspaper, a fact which has clearly contributed to a burgeoning private press in a number of African countries. Clearly, there have been these changes and developments internationally. But perhaps the most critical factors leading to what some, myself included, are calling Africa's second revolution have been internal. First of all, years of economic mismanagement have left Africa's old-style authoritarian regimes without the means to deliver even the appearance of an improving standard of living, or, in many cases, the ability to feed their urban populations adequately. In many countries, the organized apparatus of repression, often the military, augmented by party thugs and other roughnecks, is becoming disillusioned as the fruits of power and patronage gradually evaporate. Added to these developments is the fact that a post-independence African generation has come of age, often technocrats with better educations and more expertise than the old line leaders. This generation is eager to take on the responsibility of government and is increasingly frustrated by the closed, one might say claustrophobic, character of the old-style regimes. More and more Africans are demanding participation in government and a transparency associated with key decisions affecting their lives. In other words, Africans in country after country are calling for an end to corruption and kleptocracy. They are challenging the traditional forces of government repression and economic stagnation. In terms of economic reform, in many countries, economic reform, or the obvious and desperate need for such reform, is a driving force, a powerful force for change. It has become clear to almost everybody that state-controlled economies have stifled growth in sub-Saharan Africa. All too often, financial mismanagement has combined with natural disasters, high population growth, low commodity prices, misplaced priorities, and internal conflicts to create economic crisis. As the crisis has deepened on the continent, most African countries have accepted the need for economic reform and begun searching for ways to support the private sector. Although often requiring short-term economic sacrifice, structural reform is being implemented or contemplated in perhaps as many as 30 African countries today. Some critical aspects of these economic reforms are the introduction of realistic exchange rates, an end to government controls over prices, a reduction in government spending and deficits, reform or privatization of parastatal or public corporations, and implementation of realistic interest rates. The donor countries, including the United States, and the international financial institutions are encouraging reform by giving preference to countries implementing the African Economic Revolution. The Special Program of Assistance for Sub-Saharan Africa, a multi-donor initiative led by the World Bank to increase assistance to countries pursuing economic reform, has assembled a list of 21 such countries. Many of the countries which seem to be the most serious about this kind of reform are the same countries which originally implemented the most extreme kind of state controls, such as Ghana and Zambia. Democratization. One significant aspect of the kind of economic reform I've been discussing is that it empowers the private sector. It empowers non-governmental actors. It is a development which has, in that sense, parallel demands for liberalization in the political sphere. The trend towards democracy, real democracy, not democracy in name only, or the so-called democracy of the one-party state, is the strongest political and philosophical force acting on the African continent today. Most important is the fact that it is an African force, not one being posed from abroad. Since 1988, the 5 African countries with a claim to being liberal democracies, Botswana, the Gambia, Mauritius, Senegal, and Zimbabwe, have grown to at least 11, depending on precisely how one defines progress towards democracy. By early next year, if everything continues on schedule, more than 20 African countries will have held their first genuine multi-party elections. Although there remain some notable holdouts from this democratization scenario, and several authoritarian leaders who seek to manipulate the process and thereby remain in power, every country in Africa has, without exception, in some way or another, been affected by the winds of democracy blowing, howling across the continent. A retreat into the habit of authoritarianism will ultimately be no longer possible or acceptable. Neither will a return to an African government as usual, even though there have been apparent setbacks. Democracy is not perfect. It does not happen overnight. Recently, for example, the National Democratic Institute, or better known as NDI, which monitored the elections in Cameroon, concluded that the process there had not been free and fair, and that there had in fact been serious and widespread irregularities. As we examine what has taken place in Africa's democratizing countries, we see that in each case, the proximate cause of the old regime's crisis has been local, has, if you will, been self-inspired. Also, while the mechanisms of change have varied widely, from national conferences to interim governments to popular uprisings and even to orderly scheduled elections, the final result has been generally the collapse of a regime with no philosophical or popular resources save the habit of continuing in power. The early successes of this round of African democratization were dramatic indeed. In 1990, Namibia, the continent's last colony, survived years of war and several near-run crises in the last moments to become a major democratic success. Of all the people who were registered to vote in Namibia, 99% turned out. That's better than the United States. This new nation, which serves as a model of democratic governance for the rest of Africa, is a functioning multi-party, non-racial democracy whose constitution contains an entrenched Bill of Rights, providing for freedom of speech, press, assembly, association, and religion. In 1991, Cape Verde became the first African country to experience a peaceful government transition after an opposition party defeated the former single ruling party in a multi-party election. Also in 1991, in Benin, President Soglo defeated the former leader of the country by a 2-to-1 margin in free and fair elections. Soglo defeated a military dictator who had been in power for 18 years. Again, in 1991, Zambia's first multi-party presidential and parliamentary elections resulted in the defeat of President Kenneth Kaunda and brought an end to the system of one-party rule he established in 1992. He's not speaking to the former President Jimmy Carter these days. Mali and Congo have had successful elections and are now in the difficult stage of consolidating their new governments. In addition, there are many other countries engaged in the democratization process. Ghana held elections on November 3rd, the same day as our own elections here in the United States. In Niger, Guinea, and Madagascar, signs indicate that democracy has a chance to take root. Even in Malawi, where Banda continues to reign at the age of 100, a country many see as one of the last holdouts of full-blown authoritarianism, President for Life Hastings Banda has recently called for a referendum on multipartyism. I'm not, of course, suggesting that there aren't problems. Am I that boring? In several countries, the old regimes have attempted to manage change, leading to flawed processes, delays, fraud, and the deferral of the democratic dream. Processes which do not include all of a country's citizens, which do not allow for full exercise of freedom of speech, of the press, and of assembly, with free access to the media for all participants in the process, or which exclude effective voter observation and monitoring, do not have credibility either domestically or internationally, and do not lead to durable transitions to democracy. In many cases, such stage-managed transitions are backfiring, leading to civil unrest and a renewal of the pressures which demanded change in the first place. In other countries, specifically the Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, and until very recently Malawi, there has been no government movement toward change. Although the lid remains on for now in such places, it is unlikely to stay on, and democratization efforts in adjacent countries will increase the already intense domestic and international pressure on these governments to liberalize. I might also add Libya to this list. Unfortunately, in the State Department, we tend to bifurcate North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. This is to some extent the legacy of the former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. But the Organization of African Unity looks at the entire continent, and what's happening in Mali and Niger is beginning to impact on Libya. Gaddafi is quaking because he can feel the hot breath of democracy blowing down on top of him. As I noted above, short-term economic reform often remains difficult for new democracies. IMF agreements and restructuring processes tend to include measures which are unpopular and difficult for these governments to undertake consistently. It is not uncommon for political and economic reforms to be in tension, as we sometimes see in the United States. Nonetheless, I remain convinced that stability and sustained growth in Africa are impossible outside a framework of democracy and good governance. Long-term economic reform, by which is meant revitalization of the private sector, the creation of opportunities for individual Africans, the fostering of the rule of law and a stable, transparent business environment, together with a reduction in the government's role in the economy, are helped but not hampered by political pluralism. In terms of conflict resolution, you'll recall that in addition to economic development and democratization, I mentioned the third change sweeping Africa today, a movement toward the resolution of Africa's many long-standing conflicts. Conflict resolution is, in fact, an indispensable prerequisite to economic development, political liberalization, and the establishment of democracy. You would not believe how much money the United States spends on humanitarian relief, emergency relief, famine relief, disaster relief associated with conflicts in Africa. For the United States, this means simply that where there is war, the first priority is peace. Regional conflict resolution is a process we approach seriously and in which we will participate as observers, as facilitators, and as counselors. But I would like to say that conflict resolution is an awesome process. The war in Angola before the elections a couple of months ago, which unfortunately did not hold because Savimbi was defeated and he has rejected these election results. That war raged for 16 years. Mozambique, which is in the process of being resolved, is going on 17 years. I hope that Liberia can be resolved before the end of 1993. As President Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire has said to me on a number of occasions, it is very easy to start war. It is very difficult to end it, to stop it. To date, there have been some notable accomplishments and some continuing problems. In Angola, the United States, the Soviets, and the Portuguese worked closely to achieve the ceasefire which ended a 16-year-old civil war. In an attempt to ensure lasting peace, we have been assisting Angolans in their plans to move towards a democratic consensus and hold free and fair elections through which all have a role in the country's future. As the outbreak of fighting recently revealed, the Angola peace process has not been without setbacks, but we continue to believe that national reconciliation, a ceasefire agreement, and continued negotiations under the peace accords is the only possible way to achieve resolution of the conflict between UNITA and the ruling government or the MPLA. The end of the civil war in Ethiopia has produced a transitional government which is engaged in a democratic process. Our ambassador and his EC colleagues continue to pursue efforts to calm tensions in the country following an election that produced mixed results. In Rwanda, tiny East African country, the government and guerrillas are working hard to achieve a lasting settlement, and a few weeks ago signed a protocol of agreement on power sharing and modalities of a transition government. Last November, President Bush approved a $15 million package to assist in the deployment of the first ever West African Regional Peacekeeping Force, a coalition of troops from 7 countries sent to Liberia in support of attempts to provide a peaceful settlement to the civil war in that country. The United States continues to work with the United Nations and others engaged in the frustrating but vital attempts to alleviate the suffering of the Somali people. Although the general situation in Africa may have improved, serious conflicts, serious challenges remain. The tragedy in Somalia goes on without a resolution in sight. Fighting continues in Liberia, despite intensive efforts by the economic community of West African states, better known as ECOWAS, to bring about a solution. And conflict continues in the Sahel and other areas. The most encouraging aspect of attempts at conflict resolution have been the adaptation of regional organizations to help resolve conflicts, including the ECOWAS efforts in Liberia, and an increasing role for the Organization of African Unity in peacemaking throughout the continent. While the United States and other powers are interested in helping, Africans themselves are increasingly working on solving their own problems, the only long-term road to a lasting solution. In recognition of that fact, we continue to work with the United Nations, with the appropriate African regional bodies, and with the Organization of African Unity to end wars and assist in the creation of the democratic processes which are the best guarantee of peace on the continent. The consolidation of the democratization process in Africa is critical. Although we are only beginning to look at this part of the reform process, it seems that there are several factors which may be considered crucial to the success of newly democratic governments. One, the quality of leadership. What is needed here is not only the governmental skills and moderation of the new leaders, but also the willingness and ability of the new opposition, of the civil service, of military leaders and interest groups to hold together in the national interest despite ethnic, regional, and institutional rivalry. Values. The unwritten rules of the game have a strong impact on democratic give and take. Attitudes toward corruption, manipulation, and the resort to violence are a prime determinant of how long a system will last. Democracy works best when people and interest groups are willing to play by the established rules. Economic conditions. How governments deal with Africa's economic crisis will determine both their short-run success and their long-run success. The competing pressures of the need for long-term structural solutions and the political requirement to demonstrate quickly popular results, a problem which is obviously not unique to African governments, will shape most of the public debate in newly democratizing African countries for some time. I can assure you that in Africa today, an election is equated by most of the people with immediate improvements in their living standards and conditions. And we all know that an election does not bring this. I think that in America we are also riding high in terms of expectations right now. Democracy provides only a way for determining answers, not the answers. Africans themselves must supply the answers. Civil society and interest groups. Independent power centers such as interest groups, labor, students, opposition leaders, the press, and others are critical to the success of democracy. With that in mind, the democracy and governance sections of many of our aid programs have as a critical focus the development of a comprehensive and tolerant civil society. Civil-military relations. The willingness of the military to accept civilian control, even when it does not seem to be in their institutional interest, will be crucial in many African countries, particularly as fiscal crisis requires military leaders to give up many of their troops, much of their budgets, and some of their traditional privileges. The building of political and economic pluralism and democratic forms is a long-term process which will not be accomplished this year, this decade, or even in complete measure in this generation. There will be fits and starts and times when it appears reform is in retreat in individual countries or even across the continent. Conflict will probably continue to limit African reforms as in the past. The multi-ethnic societies in most of the continent, Botswana is nearly the only exception in southern Africa, will need particular care to keep tensions in check. More than any other single aspect, ethnic differences perhaps offer the greatest threat to derail even the most promising political and economic reforms. Africans will have to develop institutions which reflect the needs of their own multi-ethnic societies There is no formula, certainly no made in America formula, and the hard decisions will remain for whatever government is in power in any country. But the changes we have seen in Africa over the last few years are real. And there seems a serious willingness to confront the challenges of the future unburdened by the assumptions of the authoritarian past. And I hope with you, look forward to the Africa of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for a presentation which I think could very comfortably bridge two administrations. I see nothing inconsistent with the rhetoric of either. The floor is now open for questions. Yes, sir.
I've got a couple of very difficult questions. First of all, other than the humanitarian aid that we should continue to give as best we can, though a good deal of it seems to be like being poured down into an ocean, you did not spend enough time, I think, with the fierce tribal loyalties that beset most of Africa, that have created a conflict around Charles Taylor in Liberia. And you said nothing, although this may not be your area of expertise, but I'd like you to address the whole problem of this great revolution taking place in South Africa, and in addition to the fiercely racist Afrikaners, Chief Buthelezi is one of the principal opponents of democracy. Aren't African leaders themselves, in virulent form, the principal obstacles to anything like a continuing democracy? And Liberia ought to be a good illustration with Charles Taylor. I'd like you to be far more specific than you've been up to now.
It's my task to repeat the questions.
And I did not plant that question.
You've been asked to comment upon tribal tensions within Africa and the way in which they and the ambitions of particular tribal leaders might complicate the process which you've described.
Well, that's not the only question he asked. I'll see if I can touch on some thoughts on each one of those. Tribal, ethnic, as we anthropologists say these days, ethnic tensions in Africa are real. It's part of the landscape. To a very great extent, these ethnic tensions were exacerbated by colonialism. You know, Africa was carved up in Berlin without regard to linguistic or religious or tribal affiliation. They just decided to start drawing some lines depending upon what their interests were. And many of the conflicts that we see in Africa today, that we have witnessed in the past, the roots of those conflicts stem from what happened in 1898, I think it was, if my history is correct. I have a dream that the democratization process in time, and I think we have to keep in mind that our democracy, Western democracies, continue to evolve. There's no such thing as a perfect system. In time, I hope that political parties, responsible political parties, will evolve to the point where they become the overarching focus in a society, in a country, not one's ethnic affiliation. Look at America. We've got tribes in America. We've got African Americans, we've got Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Catholics, you name it. We've got lots of tribes in this country. And to a very great extent, we peacefully coexist because there is a political process called democracy which works. And even though I'm an African American, I can be a Republican if I want to be, and I can be a Democrat if I want to be, or I can be nothing. Because I have faith in the system, that the system, whoever's in the White House, will address at least some of my needs, my concerns, my requirements. Let's take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is a very, very complicated, powerful country, some 90 million people, but it also has some very powerfully strong ethnic conflicts and divisions. The Yoruba, the Hausa, the Igbo, the North is Muslim, the South is Christian. Nigeria is like about 100 New York cities rolled up into one. I think that will give you a graphic illustration of what I'm talking about. But as a consequence of the democratization process, which admittedly is being imposed from the top, and maybe in a country like Nigeria, a little constructive enforcement from the top might not be a bad idea. It's remarkable that the military is doing this, but the military has imposed a Republican Party and a Democratic Party, modeled after the American system. Now, the transition to a democratically elected government in Nigeria has been postponed for several months because of fraudulent presidential primaries. Nonetheless, the process continues. It's on track. Time has slipped. The schedule has slipped, but it's still on track. It's my feeling that Nigeria is a real test case for Africa. Because if the Republican Party, the Democratic Party over time in Nigeria can take care of the basic needs of all of those ethnic groups, all of those tribal groups, it will serve as a very powerful model for the rest of Africa. It's a big question mark as to whether or not it's going to work. Ethnic tensions and conflicts in Africa are recognized by everyone, especially and most importantly the Africans themselves. They want to overcome these tensions just like we want to overcome the tensions that we have within our own society. But it will take time. It is not easy to overcome those tensions which have existed for centuries. But I think that there is hope. With respect to South Africa, that's not my area of expertise, but Buthelezi, like Nelson Mandela, like de Klerk, like everybody else in that unfortunate country, is fighting for political power. I predicted many years ago that once apartheid began to fall, it was only going to be the beginning of the bloodbath. And we probably haven't seen the worst yet, because you're talking about a country that is incredibly complicated, where people have been brutalized for a long time. I have been to this country on several occasions, and it will take a lot of patience, a lot of understanding, a lot of social engineering, quite frankly, to break down the hostilities, the mistrust that is endemic, that is entrenched, that flows in the blood of these people. After all, Afrikaners vowed that they would never, never give up the system, that they would rather die than have an integrated society. But what has happened in South Africa over the past 3 or 4 years is absolutely extraordinary. It is nothing short of a miracle. But we Americans have a very short attention span. We're the most impatient people on the face of this earth. And we think that it can be done overnight. Well, I grew up in North Carolina, and I can attest to the fact that change does not occur overnight. It's a long, tortuous process. Malcolm X was released 10 days ago because we still have problems in our own society. I think that South Africa, in time, and I would not stand before you and say when that's going to be, South Africa will be one day like Zimbabwe is today, perhaps one day like the United States is striving to be, but it will take a lot of time.
Would you comment on U.S. efforts in support of population control?
Well, if Mr. Jacobs had dared to bore you with my entire CV, you would have learned that in a previous incarnation, I was Chief of Population for Africa for the Agency for International Development. And in fact, in 1972, I opened the first Africa Regional Office for Family Planning International Assistance in Ghana, and used to write pretty extensively on population dynamics and family planning. Yes, the United States does support family planning. We don't call it population control. It's referred to as family planning, maternal and child health care. It's not referred to as population control because in the 70s, the Africans were absolutely convinced that the United States was engaged in trying to control Africa's population, which from a cultural perspective and a political perspective was very difficult. Because if you know anything about African society, you know that fertility is a very important value, especially on a continent where, let's say, the average woman during her reproductive cycle will have at least 8 live births, 6 will live for a period of time, but where at least 50% in most countries will die before they reach the age of 5. So the value on fertility, reproduction, is very high. I'm an avid collector of African art, and most African art, I would say 80% of it in terms of the motif, is devoted to the health and the fertility of the mother and the longevity of the child. So in the 70s, when I got involved in population matters, and this is because I lived in India for 5 years, and you don't live in India without coming away with an indelible imprint with respect to what can happen to a country, a society that explodes literally in terms of its growth rate, its reproductive growth rate. Family planning is in every country in Africa. It is widely practiced, more widely practiced today than 15, 20 years ago when I first got involved. There is a problem with male attitudes. Men don't particularly like for their, quote, women to practice birth control because men in Africa still have this macho problem. They want to be able to show that they still can do whatever, make a baby, I guess is a blunt way to put it. But I think that as African society begins to develop economically, as health care delivery becomes more readily available, particularly in the rural areas, where you have an average of 200 deaths for every 1,000 live births, then as they see these babies born and live beyond the critical age of 5, they will naturally begin to reduce the numbers of children that they have. In rural Africa, children are a source of income, revenue, security in old age. Peasant farmers who cannot afford to go out and hire their labor reproduce it. So there's an economic reason why you have such a high fertility rate in Africa. Kenya has the highest fertility rate in Africa. It's about 4.1%. Now let me give you a quick story and then I'll end with this question. In 1975, the World Bank was involved in negotiations with the Kenyan authorities to, quote, control Kenya's population. They were talking a $100 million loan. Kenyatta, who had a degree in anthropology from the London School of Economics, went on television while these negotiations were going on, and he scoffed at population control. He said, don't worry about it, we'll take the money, but we won't give them any family planning. They got the $100 million loan. At that time, and Kenya has had good statistics for a long time, at that time the population growth rate was about 3.3% per annum. The $100 million was used not for family planning, but for health care delivery. In Kenya, the birth rate, not the birth rate, the infant mortality rate has been cut dramatically. I gave you a figure of 200 deaths per 1,000 live births for Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, some of the more backward countries, but for Kenya it's 12. In Kenya, they have moved beyond simply providing basic health care delivery to providing dental care. in the rural areas, which is a dramatic leap forward for a developing country. The $100 million was used to help bring down the infant mortality rate, because this was seen by the Kenyans as the top priority, not family planning. At that time, Kenyan women gave an average of had an average of 8 live births during their reproductive cycle. Today, the birth rate has gone from 3.3% to 4.1%. So the World Bank intervention, which was unfortunately heavy-handed and was sort of imposed, if you want $1 billion, Kenya, for your development program, that's fine, but you've got to take $100 million to control your population. Well, they took the $100 million and did what they wanted to do with it. Population growth rate went up. If there isn't a partnership between a donor and a recipient government, the donor usually ends up on the short end of the stick. Because once you put the money in the bank, you can't get it back.
Correct me if I've missed it, but I think the question is, with respect to conflict resolution, would you comment upon the impact that Soviet and American support of particular groups has had, and in turn, what that has to do with the development of democracy, or the difficulties of the development of democracy within Africa? Is that close?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Except it was phrased more blatantly, perhaps, in saying that how much has the resolution of the Cold War itself contributed to improvements in Africa?
How much has the ending of the Cold War, the removal of the United States and the Soviet competition, affected the circumstance and made democracy more easily developed?
I would say that the impact has been profound. We are no longer constrained by the Cold War rivalry. We can do basically within the boundaries of diplomacy what we want to do to encourage the growth and development of democracy. The Soviet Union and the United States were hand in glove in terms of the cooperation in resolving the conflict in Angola. We are working together with the Italians who've taken the lead in resolving the long-standing civil war in Mozambique. With respect to Ethiopia, there could not have been a resolution of the problem in Ethiopia if it had not been for the help of the Soviet Union. So I would say that the cessation of the Cold War has had a profound impact on Africa in that sense. In terms of economic development, to the extent that African countries depend upon the United States and other donors for development assistance, to assist them in moving forward. And we feel more comfortable in doing that today than perhaps a decade ago, because the Africans themselves have undertaken serious reforms in just about 30 of the 52 countries to reform their economies. Ghana is a perfect example. Jerry Rawlings, who was just re-elected, not re-elected, but just elected to the presidency in a democratic election in Ghana, imposed a structural adjustment program, a World Bank, IMF structural adjustment program some 7-8 years ago in Ghana. It is a model for all of Africa. In fact, it's a model for most third world countries in terms of economic reform. That country has been growing at an average rate of about 5.7% for the past 6 years. They have money in the bank for the first time in 12 years. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of their satellite countries, the focus in the United States and in the developed world to a very great extent in terms of development assistance has shifted to Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States, and many of the African leaders are very concerned that they're being marginalized, that now at a time when they are democratizing and they need resources, and believe me, they do, because many of the transition governments and the newly elected governments are uncovering the problems associated with military authoritarian regimes that they don't have anything to work with. And the people are screaming on the outside, we've elected you, we expect you to perform miracles. And so in the absence of significant resources from the West, many of these African governments may not make it, quite frankly.
There are really two questions. One, what does the United Nations do for Africa? And would it help if we paid what we were in arrears to the United Nations?
The United Nations is very much a part of the donor fabric of Africa. I'm not an expert on what the United Nations is doing, so I cannot cite any figures for you, but there was a series of articles in the Washington Post 6 weeks ago, I think, which talked about the United Nations, revealed all of its problems and secrets, etc. But there is a big UN program throughout Africa. There's a UN office in just about every African country through the program known as UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. The UN also has a population family planning program that's very active in Africa. The United Nations is involved in trying to feed the Somalis who are caught up in that tragic situation there. So the UN is engaged. The UN just passed, this past Thursday night, as I indicated, an arms embargo resolution on Liberia, and appointed a special envoy to go into Liberia and look at the situation and see how the UN can, working in consultation with the Economic Community of West African States, bring this civil war to an end in Liberia. So the UN is very much engaged in Africa. I can't tell you what their contribution is, but I think it's rather vast. Yes, the United States is behind in its contribution to the UN. Hopefully the new administration will, among everything else that it has to do, pay its debts.
A, are there any matriarchal societies within Africa?
Lots.
And B, how much independence do women have with respect to reproduction?
It depends on the country. There are lots of matriarchal societies in Africa. There are no women presidents or heads of state. There are no women who head military institutions. But there are lots of women ministers and parliamentarians and women who head important organizations in society. Women have a long way to go before equality before men or with men is achieved in Africa. Again, you have to go from country to country to see what the status of the situation is. Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. You can have countries adjacent to each other that are as different as night and day, believe me. Women are very powerful in many ways in Africa. Most of the food produced in Africa, most of the agriculture produced in Africa is produced by women, some 70%. Don't ask me what the men do. It's embarrassing, particularly in the rural areas. Women in West Africa are incredibly gifted in terms of entrepreneurship. I lived in Ghana for 4 years, and I will tell you that in Ghana, in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, all up and down West Africa, market women, as we call them, women who own the shops, who sell the goods, can add, multiply, divide, subtract faster than any calculator ever produced in Japan. In fact, I've had a dream for about 15 years, and that is to take 2 or 3 market women off the streets of Ghana, take them to New York City, down to Wall Street, let them get familiar with the stock exchange for a couple of weeks, and then turn them loose. They'll run those guys in pinstripe suits raggedy.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, and we wish you the very best in your next role.
Thank you.
It's been a marvelous evening.
Thank you.